From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Thursday, May 29th. A strange thing happened at the Oregon Capitol this month. An issue that once prompted Republicans to walk out en masse suddenly reemerged, and this time with the blessing of a key Republican dealmaker. Yes, cap and trade is back. But how back? Today we're going to explain what that is, why it's resurfaced, and what might happen next. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Lauren Dake.
And I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk Vanderhart.
Dirk, let's be real. This legislative session has not offered a ton for people clamoring for intrigue or even really surprise. But that changed a little bit last week.
It did, yes. And let's just get people up to speed. You are right. I think a lot has happened in this legislative session. Plenty of bills are being worked, are being passed. But I think in terms of the big questions we were asking ahead of this session, what are lawmakers going to do about transportation? Are we going to be able to find money for wildfires? What is the federal government going to mean for our budget? Some of these big things have really yet to be worked out. And so we've kind of been biding our time. We are now a month away from the end of session, I think maybe exactly. And you're right. As we were watching Democrats move forward with a transportation package they said might raise $1 billion a year, it was unclear if they could find the support for that. They put out some proposals to find funding for wildfire. It was unclear if they could find support for that. All of a sudden, a couple weeks ago, a new idea begins circulating through the Capitol, which is that in these backdoor talks between Republicans and Democrats, a new idea has emerged. They are talking about cap and trade, this hugely, consequential, very complex policy that was taken up a number of years ago, because they think that might be the silver bullet to raise some money for roads and wildfire. Maybe we can do it in the last 4 weeks of session. What the heck?
It's a new, old idea.
Yeah.
Okay, before we get too far, a challenge. Can you break down for us what cap and trade is, and also doing it so that nobody stops listening to this podcast while you're doing it?
Yes and no. No. So I've been digging into our old clips about this because it's been, frankly, so long since I've thought about cap and trade. What it basically is a way to price carbon, because there is an acknowledgement, I think, among many lawmakers that we do not want to be emitting as much carbon and carbon equivalents as we currently are. We want to ratchet that down over time. And what this would do is set a cap on the overall emissions the state is willing to emit, reduce that cap over time, and then for the state's largest polluters, so people in the utilities sector, people that distribute motor fuels, and manufacturers, they would be required to purchase credits, basically, for each ton they are emitting every year. As the cap declines, those credits theoretically get more expensive. They can trade them among each other. But basically, the state is raising money to help it break free of carbon, help citizens deal with climate change, and our emissions are being reduced every year. It's very complex. I'm not doing it justice, but that's the gist.
You did a pretty good job. Thank you. Okay, so we covered the legislative sessions during 2019 and 2020, where Republicans were so fiercely opposed to this idea that they basically were willing to derail the entire session. They walked out. Hundreds of bills died. This was something they felt very strongly about. So it's sort of remarkable, the fact that now one of the key people who is open to considering this is a Republican.
Yeah, I mean, so let's just go back to 2019, right? This is the first year, maybe the second year, actually, that Democrats pushed this, but it really looked like cap and trade was going to pass. Democrats had supermajorities. They just won in 2018. It felt like there was political will. Governor Kate Brown was on board. The top Democrats in both chambers were on board. And so what emerged was this dichotomy between Democrats and a lot of environmental groups saying, we're going to do this, basically, and Republicans and, some natural resources like loggers, farmers, foresters, but also some of the polluters, right? The industry officials, the utilities that would be regulated under this saying, no, for a couple reasons, right? We think this is going to raise costs on Oregonians. We don't think it's going to mean anything in terms of climate change. And this is just kind of a dumb idea that is going to hurt business in the state, right? We saw something in that session, though, that we hadn't seen for quite some time, which is Republicans with their new superminorities feeling pretty hopeless in terms of evincing any sort of change, decided to walk away. Actually, they walked away first over a bill that would create a new business tax for schools, the Student Success Fund, came back. Then they walked out again over cap and trade, and that was a far longer walkout. It became sort of the beginning of this really sort of brinksmanship we've seen in recent years in Salem. But ultimately, the bill died that year, not because Republicans had walked out, actually, but because it turned out in the Senate, enough Democrats had heartburn over this and what it might mean for their districts that they didn't want to support it. So Republicans came back. Actually, the session finished accomplishing quite a bit, but with that one sort of asterisk.
Right. So that was 2019.
Yep.
They come back in 2020. They get sort of the same result, another legislative walkout.
Yeah, exactly. That year, so the first year, I think it was just Senate Republicans that walked. In 2020, Democrats came back with a revamped proposal. They said, okay, we've got some more concessions we're going to make to sort of answer these criticisms, win back the Democrats that had problems with the first bill. But the House and Senate Republicans walked that year. Democrats actually, if you remember, tried to subpoena them to come to committee to explain themselves. That didn't work. Ultimately, that session, a short session in 2020, died early. I remember Speaker at the time, Tina Kotek, and Senate President Peter Courtney called us into that press conference room, sort of off the press room, and said, this session is dead. We're calling it early. We're going to pass 3 bills, and that's it, because Republicans are being intransigent. But here's the deal with how Republicans worked that, right? They were told, and the industry that opposed cap and trade were told, if you don't take this deal, we have a Democrat sitting in the governor's office in Kate Brown who's going to give you a far worse deal. She can use her executive order pen to craft her own policy, and guess what? You are not going to like that as much. She has less opportunity to be flexible with that tool. So take our deal or don't, but that's the consequence. And as soon as that 2020 session ended, Governor Kate Brown did indeed sign an executive order, which is still in effect today, and we can get to that maybe.
Yeah, let's get to that in a second here, but just one little mini step back before we go there.
Okay.
Because I just want to, put a further fine point on this idea that these walkouts were a very big deal. They garnered national attention. They played a role in the gubernatorial campaign. Ultimately, they cost some lawmakers their career, basically.
Yeah. I mean, this was the beginning of sort of Democrats saying, all right, we are being foiled repeatedly by this opportunity for them to walk out. And the unions ultimately put forward Measure 113, which folks will know is this measure that said if you have 10 or more unexcused absences as a lawmaker, you cannot run for re-election in your seat or for a seat in the other chamber in the next election. So, yeah, you're right. In 23, we saw the longest walkout in state history. That was over a number of other things. It wasn't over climate. As a result, a number of sitting Republican senators were unable to run for re-election next year. Even more will be unable to run for re-election in 2026. And so it's really caused a big changing of the guard among Senate Republicans. That measure has also made it so, in the current section, walkouts are not even being discussed, frankly, because maybe there's not something super contentious enough to rise to it, but also I think Republicans know that the price is far too high for them to do that.
Yeah, the risk is real.
Right. But your point is cap and trade is huge. Like it evinced this sort of huge political shift in Oregon because the fight was so intense at the time, right?
Exactly. Yes. Okay. So I think that really leads us up to where we are now. So we had this very intense fight where people were willing to risk their political careers, risk all their pet legislative bills, and now break down what is happening for us because this is back on the table and people don't seem to be quite as fiercely opposed.
Yes. So this gets back, part of this gets back to what I mentioned, which is that Governor Kate Brown issued an executive order. That led to the DEQ creating this whole new process called the Climate Protection Program. I think I'm getting that right. And what that program is something actually relatively similar to cap and trade. There's a declining cap on emissions. Polluters still have to pay for the right to pollute. The money is set into a side account that goes to sort of helping the state prepare and deal with climate change and maybe reduce its emissions. There's a lot of similarities. There's some big differences, and I'm not sure, I'll just be frank with you, that I understand all the nuances there. But the big thing is some of those folks who didn't like the cap and trade bill, and even some that did support the cap and trade bill and would have liked to sort of operate under that regime, say this new program, this climate protection program, is far too strict. It's far too onerous. In particular, Northwest Natural, the state's biggest natural gas utility, says it cannot possibly operate under the rules of this program. A few years out, it's just not going to be able to work under that program. So they have really been working behind the scenes to say, hey, maybe cap and trade wasn't such a bad idea. Actually, they supported the final iteration in 2020, but maybe cap and trade is not such a bad idea. Let's figure out a way to get lawmakers to say, DEQ, hold your fire, stop this program. And we as a legislature are going to figure out a way to do this. It feels, from my standpoint, so bananas, frankly, that we could have had this huge fight, gone all this way. We have a program that's coming into operation, and now we are suddenly on the precipice of maybe talking about it again. But what these folks have done is been able to talk to some key Republican lawmakers. In particular, Bruce Starr, who's a Republican from Dundee in the Senate. He's huge on this transportation discussion. He's one of the key folks sort of negotiating that issue. And he's the one saying, hey, we could raise some money with cap and trade. It's going to be maybe a little better deal for some of these polluters and utilities that really don't like it. And, I think we're going to find wins for wildfire and transportation that we wouldn't otherwise find. So that is where this is coming from.
And do you have a sense right now, like what really would distinguish the current proposal from previous proposals?
I don't. And there is like a 40-page document flying around that's this bill. You've read these bills before, Lauren. Like 40 pages of legalese instituting a cap and trade program is pretty stultifying. What we can say, though, is that in the time since cap and trade really blew up in Oregon, Washington has instituted its own policy. I think it's up and running or about to be up and running. California had one even before we were having the discussion. And those two states are probably going to be able to connect their systems so that my pollution credits in Washington can be traded for one in California. I think Quebec is involved. And so with kind of our big brother to the north, I kind of hate to say that, but having this, California has it. I think people think there is a new maybe utility for us to get on board. Maybe the West Coast can have a carbon trading system. And so that is part of this as well.
Okay, I think you have made it abundantly clear that this is a complicated policy, and we have 4 weeks left in the legislative session. What is the likelihood of this moving forward?
So that is very unclear. I have to say every single person I talk to thinks it is just not going to happen, which would make sense. I would be stunned if legislators can find agreement on this for a whole bunch of reasons. One is, there are a good amount of Republicans still left that didn't like cap and trade the first time. How are they going to rationalize a policy that they walked out over, were so furious that it was going to raise prices on Oregonians, be destructive to business? How are they now going to rationalize taking a vote that would institute it? It's a hard lift. The other is that, like the folks that really liked cap and trade the first time around hate this idea. Some of the major environmental groups that do like the policy that is moving forward in DEQ say this is basically trash. I mean, I talked to some people that said they were appalled because they believe that the cap and trade scenario that would arise in the legislature would take money that is now going to help the state sort of deal with climate change and maybe reduce its emissions. And instead, we would be sending that to road projects that are, paving highways that sort of help cars go, maybe increase our emissions overall. They call it actually cap and pave in a press release. So the environmental groups have a very different stance on this than they did in 2019 and 2020. And meanwhile, the business folks that, we are hearing it is that sector that is pushing this in the legislature. I think many of them are really reserving judgment, right? So we saw a memo from OBI, the state's largest business lobby, and they said, just to keep our members up to date, here are the discussions happening in the legislature. We kind of don't think that lawmakers can do this in time. We're very wary that even if they did do this on such a rush timeline, that it wouldn't have there would have some really unintended consequences. And so I think everyone is just kind of scratching their head that this has become such a big thing all of a sudden. But I will say, I spoke with Senate President Rob Wagner about it last week. Here's kind of what he told me about why the environment has changed from the last time we were talking about cap and trade.
You were here, I was here. This was a very different environment in 19 and 20 when you have, the business community, coming to the table being like, what, we want to have conversation here about what this looks like going forward. And So I think that like we're open to the conversation. We want to see how far we can advance on it.
And that's really all anyone's saying at this point is we are open to this conversation. It's not the most confidence inspiring, but the reason we're talking about it, Lauren, is because, there was a ton of rumors about cap and trade being in the mix. And then last week, the co-chairs of the Transportation Committee, Senator Chris Gorsuch, Representative Susan McLean, put out a sort of memo to lawmakers saying, here's an update on where we are. We're really making progress on this transportation plan. And by the way, now we're thinking about cap and trade. They didn't call it cap and trade. It was more technicalese than that. But basically, we're thinking about cap and trade to do this. We have no idea. I mean, we haven't seen a transportation bill. We haven't seen any bill for cap and trade. So we don't know how real it is, but it was real enough to be put in that memo.
Do we have a sense of how this would affect everyday Oregonians if it were to pass? Or even if it weren't to pass, right? Because then we could assume that the transportation package might mean more taxes. I mean, just what does this mean for our listeners?
Very hard to say without seeing this, right? I mean, I think we can say a couple things. Like, one is that, those arguments that a cap and trade system would hike prices for Oregonians could have unintended consequences for businesses, could lead some folks to leave the state if they felt they were overly onerous. Like, I don't see that goes away under this. Now, maybe you can make the argument that those same concerns exist under the climate protection program that Kate Brown put into effect. I'm not quite in on those nuanced levels, but at any rate, I think there's some opportunity for increased costs. But, I think people would also see more funding for wildfire preparedness, more funding for roads in a way that many lawmakers seem to think is very, very needed. So I can't quite place this in the scheme of things, especially because we haven't seen a transportation package. We don't know what this would raise. We don't know if it would be a relatively minor piece of that $1 billion a year that Democrats have sought, or a really major piece that could, avoid some of these other costs you're talking about, Lauren. They have talked about increasing the gas tax, I think by 20 cents, raising registration fees, building this new road use charge where people pay by the miles they drive as opposed to paying the gas. I mean, it's just a lot of taxes being talked about right now. Like I say, there's a month left of session, and so much it feels like to do politically that I feel a little overwhelmed at times when I think about it. I'll be frank.
I think you've given us a very good sense here of what has changed politically. But I'm wondering two things. Have you had a chance to talk to House Republican leader Christine Drazen, and if so, what has she said about this? And just generally, the question I like to ask everyone when I'm done interviewing, is there anything else you didn't get a chance to say that you would like to say?
That's a great question. I haven't spoken with Drazen about this, but she was ready when this came out. I think that they have been unsparing in that they would not support this. I mean, she led a walkout in 2020 on this very issue. It's, again, the kind of thing where what are the political, even if you acknowledge that maybe some of the folks that, you are listening to in the business community have a raw deal under the current CPP program, what are the political optics of you, especially you, Christine Drazen, as a potential aspirant to the governor's office, coming back and saying, okay, we'll pass it this time. We were wrong the first time. I can't imagine that there are lawmakers that want to take that vote. I can't imagine there are Democrats that want to sort of be seen as giving away to fossil fuel interests. It's just very, very tough. Your second question is a good one, and I can't think of anything else that I want to say, but I'm sure I'm going to kick myself when the recording goes off.
I think it's a sign that you've covered it.
Maybe.
Let's leave it there for today. Dirk, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
This week's episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded in the Gert Boyle studio. It was produced by Andrew Thien. Our audio engineer is Naleen Silva, and our music comes from Audio Network. In these uncertain times, we are certain that you have questions about local politics. Maybe we can answer them. We would love to hear from you. Email us at opbpoliticsnow@opb.org. We will be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening.